Welcome back to Adaptive. In this episode, we're going to discuss Anthropic's latest model called Mythos. It was actually announced on April 7th of 2026, but it wasn't released. It was deemed too dangerous to release by Anthropic. The reason that they said that it was too dangerous is because it had found thousands of vulnerabilities in what they said all forms of software, and that meant operating systems, applications that you use online and offline, code that it reviewed. And not only that, it was able to use complicated methods to write code to take advantage of those vulnerabilities, such as being able to chain them together to gain root access. They were so worried about it that they did not release it to the public. Instead, what they did is announce Project Glasswing. And what this project would do is open up Mythos to a select and very regulated number of vendors or companies that could then use Mythos to run it against their code bases, their applications, and fix vulnerabilities ahead of time before the pending release of Mythos. That was started right after and around that same time. If we fast forward then to June, we know that Cloud Mythos preview was released to roughly 150 critical infrastructure operators and partner organizations. These largely were financial institutions, companies with operating systems, some cybersecurity companies, so that they could evaluate and harden their systems ahead of a pending release of the model. And then on June 9th, we had Fable 5 released. And what was Fable 5? It was a version of Mythos that had guardrails in place. But we're going to discuss that more here in just a minute. So that's kind of the timeline. If we go back April 7th, they announced Project Glasswing. They opened up Mythos. They didn't release it to the public, opened it up to a select number of companies that had access to the model, very restricted access, so that they could run it and harden their operating systems, infrastructure code, applications, etc. They then opened it up even further, as we know, and got to around 150 companies. So that is what we are talking about today. However, after they released it on June 9th, the government came out, the U.S. government, and sent a control directive, export control directive, and basically said you cannot allow foreign nationals to use Mythos or Fable 5, Mythos Preview or Fable 5, those models. And Anthropic said because of that export control directive, they had no other means of enforcing that, so they had to take it down for everyone. So they pulled the model down. So Mythos as Fable 5, which was very guardrailed, was released for a few, like 3 days, 96 hours or so, before it was pulled back down and shut down. And that's what we're here to kind of dive into just a little bit more. I want to talk about it in plain English so that you can understand what happened. And it's actually a pretty fascinating story and journey as we go through this. Involves a lot of different players. We don't have the full story, just kind of to let you know ahead of time. So let's dive in. Let's go through this, move through it, just go over it in clear English. In fact, I'll use some analogies to make it easier to understand so that you can understand what's going on, because this is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Well, imagine building your business around workflows, AI workflows, or using AI for core parts of your business, or even the core part of your business, and then having a model, the U.S. government send to a provider and having that model pulled literally out from underneath your company. That would have a major impact. And with so many of us now using AI inside of our businesses and more and more and more every day, this is a big deal. This is the first time it's ever happened that we know of, I should say. Maybe they did it clandestine behind closed doors before, but the first time in public that we've seen it happen. So let's dive in and take a look at what occurred, go through the timeline a little bit, and then give you some kind of interesting details that happen. So if we look, Mythos and Fable, as you've heard me talk about, are essentially the same model. If we look, and I'm using the analogy of an engine, they have the same engine. It's just that Mythos, think of it more like a race car. It has no safety equipment applied to it, and it's for vetted and trusted organizations. So you have to have been approved to have access, and then we're given access. It is a members only, invite only. You can't get in. The bouncer won't let you in, let's say, kind of club. Let's go to Fable. Fable 5, as it was called, had the same engine, but it had a lot of safety equipment. So think of that like governors, like speed governors, like different content on it. It couldn't go fast. Maybe it had lane correction, that type of thing. So it kept you from being able to use it to hack applications, find vulnerabilities in applications or in operating systems or code, so that and also to write code that would take advantage of that. So that was the idea, that it had these guardrails in place. Think of it, like I said, a governor, so it could only go certain speeds, had to stay within the lanes. That's why they call it guardrails. And then it had monitoring and detection in that. So that's really what we're talking about. The one version for very select private use that is approved, and then for Fable 5 was opened up to everybody, but only for 96 hours. So why is this so important? Well, it is because millions of users lost access to Fable 5 at the end of 96 hours, and that seems pretty quick, which it was. But bunches of us were using it and then woke up and it wasn't there. I say woke up or tried to go use it. May not have been asleep, right? Depend upon where you are, when it happened, in terms of the time of day that it occurred. It wasn't a bug. It wasn't an outage. It was the government export control a notification that said you could not share this or allow foreign nationals to be able to have access. And Anthropic had no way to enforce that, so they had to take it down for everybody. So as it shows on the screen, this is a risk for your business. As we get more and more of AI ingrained into our workflows, our daily lives, the way we do business and core to our business, having a model pulled out could be catastrophic and could cost a lot of business, right? Your ability to do business, your ability to get revenue. So it is a very important topic, and this is the first time that we know that it happened. As I mentioned, maybe clandestine before, but it's never happened in a public setting where a model's been released publicly like this, and then because of this control mandate, export control mandate, was forced Anthropic to take it down to be able to comply. So again, big deal, especially more and more as we use AI. So what happened? They released the model. They got a letter, the export control mandate. Foreign nationals cannot have access. To comply, they had to take it down and shut it offline. Now the other models are still up. Opus 4.8 Opus are both up. It says 3 on this slide. This is pretty outdated, but 4.6 Opus and 4.8 Opus, for instance, are still up and active. So they never came down. It was just Fable 5 and Mythos Preview even, which was being used, as I said, by a very select group with Project Glasswing that Anthropic had brought out. It was, again, not a system failure. It was a compliance shutdown. So the timeline was 96 hours. June 9th is the Fable 5 launch. Let's get that right. So Mythos came out for Project Glasswing and was used by that select group of companies to be able to harden their applications and software. That was April 7th. So that had been available for a long time. On June 9th, Fable 5 came out. And so that opened up. And actually on June 7th, we know that it was that Mythos Preview was made available to some more companies, and then June 9th, Fable 5 came out, which you see on this slide. And then there was on Friday, ultimatum, a 90-minute ultimatum. And we see that on June 12th at 5:21, a formal letter was sent, and within hours it was taken offline. Model goes dark, as it says, so it was taken offline. There was obviously back and forth. There has been with the White House and the administration, and no resolution was found. So it's still down. As of this video coming out, it is still down. So let's go on to the next slide here. So why should care? Well, I covered this. If your business can be switched off overnight, if it's core to your business or core to certain workflows of your business, it absolutely could cause major disruption for you, if not outright inability to do business. So that's why it is so important that we figure this out, that there has to be a process, there has to be something put in place to assure that these types of things can't happen, a review process of some sort or something, so that we can be sure that it doesn't happen again in this way. So there's a review, and it's okay when it comes public, so that we all know that we can depend upon that model and use it and not have it taken down because of a single government, in this case the U.S., with a mandate. So the official reason, well, this is where it gets very interesting, because there has been a lot of noise, speculation, alluding of what happened, etc. So let's go with what we know. On the record, the Commerce Department had a export control order, as I have stated a number of times, that said that it can't be used by foreign nationals. It has to be only U.S. citizens. They cited a risk of diversion to a military intelligence user or user for a use case or users. And later, a public explanation pointed to concern about access by military intelligence users in China, Russia, and other countries of concern. So that was the public, on the record, reasoning from the Department of Commerce for the export control order or mandate that is led to the takedown of Mythos Preview and Fable 5. And so that's why they're not available. Now let's move over to the other side, the honest nuance. The letter stated the legal basis and risk category, but it did not lay out the specific evidence behind the alarm that basically had this happen so quickly. The Secretary Fuller, the Secretary's Fuller explanation came after the fact. Yeah, so it wasn't even made public ahead of time. It wasn't. In fact, Anthropic said they didn't have a specific reason early on. They just got the mandate. So, the public record explains why there's concern, but not the underlying reason or evidence of why it was taken down, which that's why it's so problematic, because it could be, as we'll see, there's some other things that have occurred that some allude to the fact that could have some influence on why this happened. And if so, then it's more than just because of military reasons or security concerns. I'll say that. Let's get into those as well. So the reported trigger, there was a so-called jailbreak. Reports suggest the spark was, this jailbreak, meaning the spark is what ignited this to happen. So, they said a scary hack was reported a little more. When I say this is kind of the discussion out there, and even Anthropic has mentioned this, that the hack that led to this was little more than handling the model some code and asking it to, quote, fix this code. The single most ordinary thing anyone could use a tool for. Yeah, that's used all the time, right? I mean, we code, myself included, say fix this code. What one outside expert who read the paper said that it was asked to find security flaws, the model refused. But if it was asked to fix the code, it complied. So you can see the nuance there, right? Hack this essentially. No, I won't. The guardrails come into place, the governor takes effect, the monitoring is there. But if you say, hey, fix this code, and you do it in such a way that it also points out vulnerabilities that you can then take advantage of, see how that works? Then because you look at what it fixed and you go, oh, that's a security hole or vulnerability I didn't see or know about. Now I know I want to take advantage of that. That's the nuance here that we're talking about. So how did this come to be? Well, there are rumors slash I think there's noise. That's the way I would put it. That Amazon research had found this, what was going on. So the paper reportedly came from researchers at Amazon, and Amazon CEO Jazzy flagged it to a cabinet official, so shared it and sent it. This came on top of an earlier government grievance about a foreign telecom with alleged China ties getting access to Mythos. So it's alleged, we don't know that, but there supposedly was a government grievance that said that occurred. And then 3, there was worry about copies. So there's basically that they're saying the model could be copied once access is in the wrong hands. Okay. I think the first two, which is so interesting about Amazon because they are a big investor in Anthropic. So it's really, and not only that, they host it on their site, they use it in their tools, they use the Claude models. So it's really interesting if it did occur and come from Amazon that they are, I don't know, they're such a proponent of Anthropic and Claude that are invested in them. So it had direct impacts on them as well. So maybe they did see something. You try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then a senior administration figure says that the White House offered Anthropic a choice: fix it or pull it. Okay, the CEO refused. Versus Anthropic saying they dispute that framing and say the situation is more complex than a single ultimatum. I think it would be very, very, very difficult for Anthropic to comply with this. I mean, how do they know if you're a foreign national accessing their model, and what kind of proof do you have? You'd have to take all your users and they would have to go through some sort of scrutiny to be able to prove that claim. And then you're going to have to also make sure that everybody using Mythos Preview, remember, they had 150 companies using it, that every user that they have is also not a foreign national. And in fact, and that's where that government grievance came from. They said it was one of the companies, I think a Korean company, that had access to Mythos Preview that they felt was sharing it with a Chinese national, which caused a military / security risk. So everyday use of the model, meaning the fix this code, was how they said they were able to get it to bypass guardrails and find holes. But that's kind of tough as well, as we'll see and discuss here. So here's what's unknown. Okay. So benchmarks don't talk about a unique danger. If we look at standard evaluations, the model is not an outlier. Other leading models showed similar capabilities, such as if you said fix this code, they would find vulnerabilities. In fact, they found the majority of the same vulnerabilities in test. And that's what we're talking about with standard benchmarks and standard evaluations. As, for instance, ChatGPT 5.5 codex. So it isn't unique to just Mythos and Fable 5. The jailbreak is trivial. Like I said, fix this code. And it's not saying find security flaws, but by fixing the code, it will often find and point out, hey, this is a potential vulnerability. Let's fix this. That's how they're then using using these models to find and get around the guidelines or guardrails. The guardrails. So, as it says again, rival models do the same thing and no public indication of unique risk at the time. So what we can't see, and makes sense. We don't have the specific evidence, classified sources and methods that are out there, broad claims of limited public with limited public detail, and the trust us, meaning like we're saying to trust us. Now, you might think, why is that a big deal? The government all the time has classified reasons for doing things, and I don't disagree. However, there are times for the government to be able to do that, to not be so pure about their motives, about the fact that it is a true security hole, or it is truly capabilities that, in the wrong hands, would give foreign governments and maybe terrorist organizations ability, and cyber criminals the ability to do harm, right? Do harm and in to the U.S. and to companies and the U.S. Interests. So, we have public checkable evidence that points one way, and then we have to accept on faith the other, is basically the key takeaway of this. So here's why the foreign I already kind of covered this, but the rule for export control, there was no way to really enforce that, so they had to basically shut it down. So an analogy here: a restaurant, you may not serve a certain dish to people of certain nationalities. How do you prove that? You realize you can't, and so the only thing you can do is take that dish out of the kitchen. And that's essentially what Anthropic has had to do. They had no way to prove it, so they had to take the model down and make it so it wasn't available to everybody. So as it says over here, it's just really not. It's a blunt instrument at the bottom, as it says, on a point, for software, which is very difficult to enforce. So it didn't happen in a vacuum. This is why I think this is really interesting, because this is where the purity of the claim, the trust us, comes into effect. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, and I'm not trying to say anything political, but we do have this as a background or a backdrop. There were months of tension between Anthropic and the administration. In fact, it got to a point because they had asked Anthropic, when I say asked, they had said that they were going to use models for certain circumstances that Anthropic disagreed with. And those circumstances were to directly make a decision to, let's say, attack a human being or drop a bomb. And Anthropic said they would not comply with that. They did not want to comply with that, for instance. So because of that, they were then deemed a supply chain risk, which is a major classification, right? Because most of the times that's a foreign company that we're talking about, not a local provider. And that was, most people thought and felt, way too heavy-handed and way over the top for not wanting to comply with their demand, let's say, of harming or allowing their models to kill people. Let's be honest, to kill people. And I get both sides of that equation or story, where the U.S. government says we should be able to do with it as we want, but I also think a private company should be able to say, we have some boundaries here of what we want to allow or be done with our model, and killing people is not why we built this model. So I see both sides of the story. It's still an ongoing lawsuit, and there's been public back and forth. We've seen it, well reported, between the administration and Anthropic. So what does that mean? It means that we're supposed to trust, but there's this conflict that has occurred and is still ongoing, frankly, and it is illegal as well. So we can't ignore the disagreement, and there's a pattern of conflict relevant to assessing risk. So it could weigh in on the government, how they assess the risk. Is a company that they've already had and have labeled a supply chain risk, and then as it says, it helps explain why the scrutiny is so high. But it also is interesting that there's no direct evidence. Other factors could explain what happened, and correlation's not causation, as they say. So, it isn't black and white or completely clear, I would say. I think there is definitely, with this backdrop in place, it's very interesting to see them pull basically give a demand that pulled this model down without clear evidence. So we've kind of hit upon this, but now that you have all the information, kind of that backdrop, you can see how this can be very concerning, and especially when we put it in the lens of other companies outside of the United States and governments. Okay, so is this a new government template? A leading AI company was forced to pull a live product. We haven't seen this before. It's never happened in public. Is this a template for treating advanced AI like a controlled export? I think it probably is. So what does that mean? Well, think they've already controlled the export of chips and weapons and other, aircraft and all kinds of different systems out there, that networking equipment, and other technologies. They have controlled their export outside of the United States to protect the United States interests. And that's already been done. So now we've seen it happen with a AI model. And that's essentially what they did. They protected the U.S. interests with that export control order. And that's why they claim that they have done it. Let's look at the global ripple, though. Let's say that you're another country. Germany, UK, France, whoever, right? Israel. And you have this model come out, and you want to use it and make a deal with Claude, or Anthropic, I should say, to use Claude and Fable 5 or Mythos Preview. And that model now has been pulled out from underneath your ability to use it. That's a major deal. In fact, we've already seen governments respond and say they are now more than ever going to probably give favoritism towards their own models, their own country's models, or at least maybe it's the EU model versus the US model, so that it can't be pulled out, the rug can't be pulled out from underneath them. And you can understand that. Just like the U.S. interests have to be protected, their interests in their minds need to be protected. So we need our own AI model, the sentiment abroad. And it may create openings for like Chinese models, which are open source. That means you can download the source code and run them yourself on your own hardware, essentially. So countries may adopt that. That means that China wins in that scenario. Why? Because they're using their models and not ours. And that who knows where that goes. Let's just say that could be a very slippery slope for the United States as well. So the concentration of risk, as they said, if you are using as a company, one company, let's say your company uses Anthropic only, we've seen now there's a big risk. And it could be the same could happen to ChatGPT in the future. It could happen to Google Gemini. It could happen to any of the models out there. If you're only using one model and your business and your ability to operate are dependent upon that model, when it's pulled down, it affects you and may keep you from being able to do business or crippling you, in many ways. So, government action potentially in the future, same as this, lawsuit, who knows what could happen, or an outage. They can break your ability to do business. They can make it where, you're crippled. So this kind of highlights a reason to have a fallback plan designed for being able to switch the model out and, obviously not single threaded as it says. What that means is dependent upon a single provider, have the ability to be able to use multiple different providers should something happen. So where does it stand currently? It's currently unresolved. There has been discussions between Anthropic and the White House, but so far there's no resolution. So their talks are ongoing. As of this video, I should say, no resolution. What are the critical open questions? When a tool becomes powerful enough to matter, who decides on what evidence and how fast, whether you're able to use it? That is a crucial question. Who decides? Is there authority and accountability? What is the evidence? What's the standard that they have to provide so that we have a reason why, and we can assure that it wasn't because they're in a conflict with them, or maybe because they favor another provider? How fast? What's the timeliness that it takes it down instantaneously without any notification? And whether you're allowed to use it. Who has access? Who doesn't? Who controls that access? Who doesn't? And what are the exemptions for being allowed to access? Those are all open questions at this time. So that really is kind of concludes what we're looking at here. We don't need to take any sides, but we can say there is a lesson here to be learned. And so the reliability of an AI tool now includes political and regulatory risk, and we have to keep that in mind. Diversity is important. Being able to have at least multiple models, and I would say cross-vendor, cross company. So Anthropic, ability to use Anthropic and OpenAI and ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini from Google would make sense. I think a lot of sense, and have that tested and ready to go. It's almost like a power backup that you have at your company, so that if the power goes out, your main power, that's who you're going to use, whoever the provider is, and you have the generator ready to kick on when and if that happens. Well, that's the same thing. That the lesson to be taken out of this is, just like if the power goes down, you can't do business. Then you need to have a backup, and that's that other generator. Well, in this case, it's having another model from another provider so that you can switch over. That flexibility, design the workflows so it can switch models. Well, that's again same thing, being able to work from either the main power or the generator power. Monitor the risk. Yeah, keep track of what's going on out there that could cause disruption. You have your fallback plan. That's the generator, and in this instance, it's another provider of some sort. And then keeping informed. Powerful AI now isn't just a technical choice anymore. It's a strategic, because it has strategic and regulatory exposure. That's it for this episode. I hope this was informative. I'd love for you to like and subscribe so that you can be informed when the next one comes out. It helps a lot, and I'd love to hear from you. So leave a comment or submit a question.